The Sumerians weren't the only people in Mesopotamia. The Akkadians settled north of the city of Uruk. So here is Uruk, and here is Sumer. A little bit north of that, we see Akkad, and possibly their capital was here. We're not quite sure if that's where it was located. But in any rate, the Akkadians started to dominate this area in brown north of Sumer. And you'll notice that there are arrows because this is a very militaristic culture and their territory really expanded. They spoke a language that was in the family of Hebrew and Arabic, and they adopted a lot of Sumerian custom and cultures. And this makes sense because they were in the same place at the same time. However, in 2331 BCE, they conquered Sumer under the leadership of the very powerful chieftain King Sargon. And they create a new empire. And King Sargon now becomes the first conqueror because he was able to, with military might, expand the boundaries of Akkad and move south and move west. It's a short-lived empire, but a very large one. And the army spreads not just the boundaries of Akkad, but also spreads its culture throughout Mesopotamia. King Sargon himself becomes very powerful during his lifetime and elevates himself to the status of a god. And in previous lectures, we have talked about the strategies for asserting leadership, one being claiming divine power, divine authority through an association with a god. Here's another way to go. King Sargon declares himself to be a god once he has attained a certain amount of power. And part of this power is through the visual communication of leadership. Here we're looking at an Akkadian stele, and a stele is a stone slab that's vertically oriented with relief sculpture. And we'll be seeing a few more of these as we study ancient cultures. This one is called the Victory Stele of Naram Sin. Naram Sin is the great-great-grandson of King Sargon and continued his empire. It commemorates a particular military victory against a mountain people called the Lullaby people. It is mostly in good shape, but we see some damage, especially at the top. The damage, however, is not in the overall shape of the object, which, as you can see, it was probably selected because it echoes the shape of a mountain that is depicted in the imagery. As we've seen with Sumerian art, it is very well organized. It's usually organized in registers, horizontal bands that separate different elements of narrative. It's rhythmic, it is clear, and it's very well organized. Here we see a narrative without registers. We can see a ground line in places, and a ground line refers to this line on which the figures are standing. We had this in, for example, the Standard of Ur as well, or the Warka vase, where in Sumerian art it was a flat, straight, horizontal line, very clear where it was. Here we kind of have to look for it. And this waving line that goes up the side of the mountain represents a mountain ledge on which the figures are standing. Who is the most powerful figure? It's very clear that this is Naram Sin. He is the largest figure by far. In fact, he actually is almost as big as the mountain. He seems to be scaling. This is called hieratic scale, in which the relative importance of a figure is shown by the scale. He's also in the center of the composition. It's clear by his placement that he's the most important, and he's higher up than everyone else. He's the closest to the top of the mountain. As Naram Sin approaches the mountain, we see that he's also approaching three solar deities, three sun gods. And we can actually only see two of them. There was probably a third here that is now missing. He is wearing a bull-horned headdress, and we've seen in other objects that a bull is important to a culture as it's associated with power. So it's a symbol of leadership. Some also think that this headdress is associated with the weather god, Adad. Naram Sin is depicted as a military figure. He is very clearly holding both a spear and a bow and arrow as he confidently puts one foot in front of the other and walks up the mountain. He is actually stepping on his foes. So as he is walking, he is also crushing his enemy. As he approaches the mountain, he's faced with two figures here, and there is some debate as to who they are. Some scholars believe that one of them might be a priest, and another one might be a trumpeter announcing the arrival of Naram Sin. They also could be the enemy, and they are kind of quaking in fear as he approaches. In cuneiform, and there's a cuneiform inscription right here, we see that this is a recorded occurrence. So we look to not just the imagery that records this military victory, but also to text, to written text. And this cuneiform is difficult to translate because it comes from the Akkadian, and some of the letters are missing, some of the words are missing, but the best translation I could find is something like this: Naram Sin the Powerful, and then there's kind of a blank part. Sidr and Sultuni, the princes of the Lullaby, gathered together and they made war against me. So in the inscription, if I'm reading that right, it declares a justification for the going to war against these people, this mountain people called the Lullaby. So in this object, we see a different approach to the expression of leadership. Here, Naram Sin is asserting his right to lead by referring to his military success, just in general, in terms of the way he's depicted with his headdress and his weaponry and his army, but also referring to a very specific military conquest. You'll notice that the space is less organized than Sumerian objects that we've looked at. That is not, I'm not referring just to the lack of registers, but the fact that all of the people in the right side of the composition are defeated, and we see kind of chaos and disorganization, as opposed to the relative organization of Naram Sin's army, which is following him in an orderly way. I think we can contrast then the Akkadians with the Sumerians in terms of their view of leadership and power.